I do not speak to you today as a preacher, and I do not speak as a politician seeking approval. I speak as a human being who has lived close enough to power to understand how easily it reshapes the soul. I was formed by Africa, by Islam, by long, honest conversations with Christians, and by the quiet discipline of places where survival depends not on authority, but on humility. I am not here to accuse anyone. I am not here to humiliate a leader. I am here to offer a warning. Because in leadership, there are moments that appear small, even clever, yet they quietly decide the direction of an entire life. Not long ago, the world watched a public speech, broadcast live and repeated endlessly across social media, cable news, and late-night commentary. A powerful leader stood behind a historic podium and openly mocked the name of Jesus Christ. It was not spoken in anger. It was not a private remark caught by accident. It was delivered calmly, confidently, and with irony before millions. Some people laughed. The laughter sounded educated, relaxed, modern. Pundits quickly framed the moment as bold. Others defended it as free speech. But outside studios and political panels, something very different happened. Even many Americans who do not attend church, who do not pray, who would never describe themselves as religious, felt a sudden and unfamiliar discomfort. Not outrage, not offense. Discomfort. As if an invisible line had been crossed. In homes, in group chats, in quiet conversations between friends, one simple sentence kept returning. Some things should not be ridiculed. But what disturbed people was not theology. It was posture. They were not asking whether the remark was legal. They were asking something much more human. If a leader treats what millions consider sacred with casual mockery, what else does he treat lightly? From where I stood, far from Washington and far from the media spotlight, the moment did not look dramatic. But it felt decisive, because history rarely turns on explosions. It turns on small choices that reveal who a leader believes he no longer needs to respect. Nothing collapsed that day. No institution fell. No market crashed. But something shifted, quietly, almost politely, and what followed did not resemble punishment. It began to resemble consequence. Within hours, the clip traveled faster than any policy announcement, faster than any trade agreement, faster than any military order. It crossed oceans, it crossed languages, it crossed political loyalties. It appeared on phones in small towns where the evening news still matters. It appeared in living rooms where grandparents keep a Bible beside the television. It reached young Americans who rarely think about faith at all, yet still felt something they could not name. This is the first lesson power often forgets. Words are lighter than weapons, but they travel farther. No government instructed people to share that speech. No activist network organized a campaign. No political party coordinated its spread. It moved on its own, as if the words themselves carried an unusual weight. What struck me most was not outrage, it was hesitation. People did not rush to attack the speaker. They paused. They replayed the clip. They listened again. They watched the face, and they listened to the tone. Many who shared the video added no caption at all, just the clip, just silence. In a culture as loud as America's, silence is rarely empty. It is often a signal that something has unsettled people more deeply than anger ever could. In my part of the world, elders say that when a man insults what others hold sacred, he is not proving courage. He is quietly testing whether the ground beneath him still holds. and I saw something remarkable. Muslims wrote, "We do not worship Jesus as Christians do, but we know a prophet should not be mocked." People who openly said they believed in nothing wrote, "I'm not religious, but this still felt wrong." That moment became dangerous, not because people were offended. It became dangerous because people recognized a boundary. But when citizens across belief systems, across race, politics, and culture, feel that the same line has been crossed, that line is real. It exists whether leaders acknowledge it or not. The media tried to reduce the moment. They labeled it controversy. They framed it as another episode in the culture war. They debated intention, tone, and political strategy. But ordinary Americans were not debating politics. They were asking a simpler question. If a leader speaks this casually about what millions consider sacred, what else does he treat lightly? Trust does not collapse in explosions. It erodes, quietly, like soil disappearing under steady rain. I noticed how often the video circulated without commentary. No hashtags, no slogans, no insults. Just the image of a man smiling at his own words. In leadership, that perception becomes reality faster than truth can defend itself. Once doubt enters, it does not ask permission to stay. And from that moment on, every future statement from that leader would be heard through a new filter. Not because people suddenly became hostile, but because reverence, once broken, does not return quickly. This is how consequence begins, not with chaos, but with attention. And attention, once sharpened, starts to see everything. The next change did not appear on television screens. It happened in rooms where cameras are never invited. Support does not disappear loudly. It withdraws politely. No senior ally resigned in protest. No coalition collapsed overnight. No dramatic press conference announced a break. Instead, something far more revealing occurred. The inner circle grew quieter, which people who once spoke freely began to measure every sentence. Advisors who once interrupted now waited. Trusted voices spoke last instead of first. Eye contact shortened. Meetings ended a little earlier than usual. Those who have never led believe loyalty is permanent. It is not. Loyalty rests on confidence, and confidence rests on moral steadiness. When a leader publicly mocks what others deeply revere, even his closest partners begin to ask questions they rarely speak out loud. Will this person listen when warned? Will he recognize limits? Will he treat our values as disposable too? The danger is not disagreement. The danger is unpredictability. I watched public events where familiar figures no longer stood beside him. Joint appearances quietly disappeared from calendars. Longtime partners declined invitations, not with anger, but with scheduling conflicts. In diplomacy, distance is a language. It says, "I am waiting to see who you are becoming." Even applause began to change, not in volume, in timing. A fraction of a second too late, a fraction of a second too short. Small signals. But in leadership, small signals carry enormous meaning. Inside ministries and advisory offices, people began to hedge. Documents were rewritten with softer language. Decisions were delayed. Risk assessments quietly changed tone. This was not sabotage. It was self-protection. Those closest to power feel storms before they reach the city. They sense when leadership begins to drift from balance. And what troubled me most was not criticism from opponents. Opposition always speaks. What troubled me was the absence of defense. When allies no longer rush to explain you, they are preparing, slowly and silently, for a future without you. The leader still stood at podiums, still signed papers, still commanded institutions. But authority without trust is a costume. It looks complete, until movement exposes the seams. He believed the moment had passed. He mistook silence for acceptance. But silence can also mean waiting, and waiting, when combined with disappointment, becomes judgment. Not divine judgment, human judgment, the most unforgiving kind. The third consequence did not arrive as scandal. It arrived as confusion. In leadership, you are revealed not only by what you say, but by what you choose, especially after a moment that tests your character. Within weeks, decisions began to feel different. Not reckless on the surface, not obviously irrational, just disconnected. Policies appeared without the patience that had once defined them. Economic signals contradicted earlier commitments. Strategic priorities shifted without a clear explanation of why. Experts searched for technical causes. They spoke about pressure. They spoke about fatigue. They spoke about political calculation. All of that sounded reasonable, but ordinary people described it in a quieter, sharper way. They said arrogance blinds. In African tradition, wisdom is not intelligence. Wisdom is alignment. It is the ability to remain in harmony with reality, with limits, with people, and with consequence. When a leader drifts out of alignment, even clever decisions begin to collide with the world instead of shaping it. I have seen this pattern many times, in presidents, in generals, in governors, and in village chiefs. The moment a man convinces himself that reverence is weakness, clarity soon follows it into exile. What was striking was not one bad decision. Anyone can make a mistake. It was the pattern. Corrections were delayed. Warnings were brushed aside. Confidence remained high, even as results deteriorated. This is the hidden danger of mockery. It trains the mind to dismiss restraint. Once a leader learns to laugh at what others consider sacred, it becomes easier to laugh at caution, easier to laugh at history, easier to laugh at limits. One evening, after reading another headline, I prayed, not for the leader's failure, but for his awareness, because the absence of awareness is the true collapse. In Christian teaching, pride is not loud. It is persuasive. It whispers that you are beyond consequence. In Islam, as arrogance is not strength, it is blindness dressed as certainty. Across faiths, the lesson is the same. When humility leaves, confusion enters. The public began to sense it. Markets did not panic. They hesitated. Institutions hesitated. Foreign partners hesitated. And hesitation is contagious. The leader responded by speaking more, explaining more, asserting more control. But explanation cannot replace coherence, and authority cannot replace trust. Old speeches resurfaced. Words that once sounded steady now felt strangely hollow. The same voice, the same tone. But something essential was missing. Peace. No policy can compensate for the absence of inner balance. No strategy survives when the compass is broken. This was not punishment from heaven. It was exposure. You do not lose wisdom all at once. You leak it. Slowly, quietly, until one day even your supporters no longer know where you are leading them. And that is when leadership becomes dangerous. Not because it is evil, but because it no longer knows where it stands. The next sign did not appear in policy documents or briefing notes. It appeared on the leader's face. Those who have watched power closely learn a difficult truth. Before collapse becomes public, it becomes personal. In later appearances, something subtle changed. The eyes no longer rested. They searched. The voice, once measured, began to circle itself. Sentences repeated. Ideas returned again and again, as if reassurance were being sought rather than offered. Pauses grew longer in places where confidence once lived. Commentators spoke about stress. They spoke about pressure. Well, they spoke about the weight of office. All of that may be true, but people spoke differently in private. They said, "He doesn't look at peace." Peace is not only a religious word, it is a psychological state. It is the harmony between what a person believes and how that person behaves. When a leader violates something sacred, even casually, the mind does not forget. It argues at night. It replays moments that applause cannot erase. I have known soldiers who survived battle without fear, yet could not sleep. Not because of danger, but because of unresolved meaning. Power works in the same way. Sleep becomes fragmented. Thoughts become crowded. Words spoken lightly return with unexpected weight. This is not superstition. It is conscience. Gestures became sharper. Smiles arrived late and left early. Laughter sounded forced, like a door closing instead of opening. Those who stood nearby felt it. They adjusted their own posture, their own tone. A leader's inner state radiates. It always has. In Christianity, rest is not rest from labor. It is rest from conflict within. In Islam, the heart finds rest not in dominance, but in remembrance. When remembrance disappears, rest follows it into exile. I do not say this leader lost peace because of divine anger. I say he lost peace because mockery fractures integrity. And integrity, once cracked, leaks energy. You can command institutions and still feel unguarded. You can control systems and still feel pursued. People began to whisper, not that he was weak, but that he was unsettled. And in leadership, unsettlement spreads faster than fear. And a leader who is no longer at peace begins to chase certainty. Certainty through control, control through force, force through speech. The volume rises, the clarity falls. I watched interviews where answers no longer matched the questions, where defensiveness arrived before accusation, where silence felt heavy instead of thoughtful. This is the cost of crossing invisible lines. Not immediate disaster, but inner erosion. And inner erosion, left unattended, eventually becomes public collapse. What came next surprised even those who had sensed something was wrong. It did not come from political movements. It did not come from opposition leaders. It did not come from activist organizations. It came from ordinary people, quietly, without coordination, without publicity. Prayer began to rise, not as protest, not as threat, not as spectacle. In small churches across America and across continents, people gathered without cameras, without banners, without statements. Just worn books, just lowered heads, just silence long enough for honesty to return. What made this moment extraordinary was not its size, it was its tone. People were not praying for punishment. They were praying for mercy. I read messages from Christians who wrote, "We are not asking God to strike anyone. We are asking Him to soften hearts." I read messages from Muslims who wrote, "We ask God to protect the world from arrogance wherever it appears." There was no leader behind it, no organization directing it, no strategy guiding it. And precisely because it was spontaneous, it carried something power cannot manufacture. Authenticity. This unsettled many observers. Power understands protest. Power understands resistance. Power understands anger. It does not understand quiet moral unity. In Africa, we know this pattern well. When elders gather without announcing it, something serious is happening. When prayers begin without instruction, it means people feel that a danger can no longer be addressed by arguments, elections, or influence. The leader never acknowledged these prayers. Perhaps he never noticed. Perhaps advisors filtered such reports away. But prayer does not need permission to exist. It moves through channels beyond approval and beyond control. What struck me most was the absence of hatred. No calls for downfall. No celebration of failure. No desire for humiliation. Only concern. And concern is heavier than anger. Anger burns quickly. Concern stays. For believers, because prayer is not magic. It is alignment. It is the decision to place hope outside human control. And that is precisely why it unsettles power. Because it reminds leaders, especially in a culture as confident as America's, that influence has limits. That authority has edges. That control is never complete. Late one night, I found myself reflecting on this quiet wave of prayer. And I asked myself why it mattered. It mattered because it revealed something most political analysis had missed. The issue was never political. It was moral. People were not reacting to a policy. They were reacting to a posture. A single moment of mockery had awakened something deeper than outrage. It awakened responsibility. People felt compelled to respond not as voters, not as partisans, but as human beings. In Christian faith, Christ does not answer mockery with force. He answers it with patience, with silence, with an invitation to return. That is what these prayers represented, an invitation. But invitations can be refused, and refusal carries its own consequences. The tragedy was not that prayers were offered. The tragedy was that they were not heard. Not because God is deaf, but because pride is loud. When a leader no longer listens inwardly, even quiet mercy passes unnoticed. And mercy, when ignored, does not chase. It waits. The next consequence arrived faster than many expected. Not in parliaments, not in speeches, not in public confrontations. It arrived in airports, in canceled meetings, in delayed calls, in invitations that quietly stopped coming. International standing does not collapse through announcements. It collapses through absence. Summits were rescheduled without explanation. Bilateral meetings were postponed indefinitely. Agendas were rearranged without his name. No government issued a condemnation. No one needed to. In diplomacy, respect does not withdraw with noise. It simply stops showing up. The leader continued to travel. He continued to speak. He continued to project confidence. But the rooms felt different. Seats once reserved remained empty. Handshakes shortened. Conversations ended earlier than planned. Foreign leaders smiled politely, but their eyes asked questions their words would not form. Is this man steady? Is he restrained? Is he safe to align with? These were not ideological questions. They were instinctive ones. But in many cultures, including my own, we say quietly, "A man who laughs at sacred things may also laugh at agreements." Trust does not survive that suspicion. Media outlets that once amplified every statement now summarized them, then reduced them to short segments, then ignored them altogether. Silence returned, but not the silence of reflection, the silence of irrelevance. New conversations began without him. New alliances formed without his presence. New priorities moved forward without his voice. Not because he was blocked, because he was no longer considered necessary. Reputation, unlike power, cannot be enforced. It must be earned again and again, and it can be lost without a single official decision. I watched how quickly the language changed. Once described as bold, he was now described as unpredictable. At once framed as fearless, he was now framed as careless. Language follows perception, and perception hardens faster than truth can correct it. The leader responded by speaking more forcefully, by reminding the world of his authority, by invoking history, by invoking strength. But authority that must be repeatedly announced is already slipping. He had confused attention with respect. He had mistaken provocation for courage. And the world, patient, restrained, and quietly decisive, corrected him. The most painful outcome was not public criticism. It was being bypassed. No dramatic fall, no grand confrontation, just closed calendars, unreturned calls, empty corridors. This is how the world disciplines leaders who forget reverence. Not with fire, but with forgetting. The final consequence was the most unsettling, and not because something happened, but because something never did. There was no apology, no moment of pause before a microphone, no quiet acknowledgement that something sacred had been mishandled. No sentence that began with the simplest and most difficult words a leader can speak. I was wrong. The world waited longer than expected. Supporters waited. Critics waited. Even those who had prayed waited. Nothing came. In leadership, silence can be strategy, but silence can also be captivity. The refusal to admit error is rarely courage. It is fear. To say, "I was wrong," requires standing unprotected before your own conscience. It requires breaking the illusion that authority shields the soul. In Christian faith, repentance is not humiliation. It is liberation. It is the moment a person stops running from light. In Islam, repentance is not weakness. It is return. Return to balance. Return to truth. Across faiths, the wisdom is identical. Acknowledgement heals faster than denial ever can. But the leader did not return. He doubled down. Each speech hardened in tone. Each interview reinforced deflection. Blame moved outward, then sideways, but never inward. This is the final stage of separation. Not separation from allies, not separation from institutions, separation from self. When a leader can no longer say, "I crossed a line," that line does not disappear. It becomes a wall. People felt it. They could not always explain it, but they recognized it. The prayers slowly faded, not because people stopped caring, but because many understood something painful. Mercy had been offered and ignored. In Christian teaching, God does not force repentance. He allows distance. Distance is not punishment. It is permission to continue walking away. The leader remained powerful on paper, still surrounded by protocol, still protected by systems, but inwardly, something essential had hardened. I have learned that leadership does not truly end when power is lost. It ends when humility becomes impossible. This story is not about one man. It is about every person who stands behind a microphone, every person who commands attention, every person whose words shape public space. Power does not purify character. It magnifies it. What already lives inside a person becomes larger, louder, and more influential. If humility is present, power becomes service. If pride is present, power becomes domination. If fear is present, power becomes cruelty disguised as strength. I do not tell this story as a Christian preacher, and I do not tell it as a Muslim judge. I tell it as a human being who has watched pride dress itself as bravery too many times. There is no satisfaction in watching another leader lose balance. There is no honor in another person's quiet unraveling. There is only instruction, paid for at great cost. Africa has suffered too long under leaders who believed themselves immune to consequence. Men who confused fear with loyalty. Men who mistook silence for consent. Men who believed position could replace conscience. The world has made the same mistake, only with better language, better suits, and better technology. Arrogance does not disappear when it travels. It only learns new accents. To my Muslim brothers and sisters, I speak with respect. As reverence is not weakness. Submission to God is not the surrender of dignity. It is the discipline that prevents power from becoming an idol. It is the inner boundary that protects leaders from worshiping their own influence. A heart that bows is harder to corrupt. To my Christian brothers and sisters, I speak plainly. Christ was mocked long before modern leaders discovered sarcasm. He was humiliated publicly. He was misrepresented deliberately. He was laughed at by those who believed strength meant dominance. Yet history did not bend toward mockery. It bent toward endurance. Your faith has survived empires not because it shouted louder, but because it remained steady when others collapsed. It does not depend on applause, and because of that, it cannot be destroyed by ridicule. To leaders in America, in Africa, and beyond, I will not speak in metaphors. Weapons may secure borders for a season. Money may buy time for a generation. But humility secures legacy. Power without humility does not last. It hardens, it fractures, and eventually it isolates itself. Nations do not collapse because they are criticized. They collapse when leaders stop listening, when they treat dissent as betrayal, when they confuse discomfort with danger, when they mistake restraint for weakness. We are living in an age that rewards provocation, an age where outrage is currency, where mockery is marketed as courage, where patience is portrayed as passivity. But history is not written by those who trend for a moment. It is written by those who endure long enough to be remembered. I have learned, slowly and imperfectly, that God does not hurry. Truth does not shout, and conscience does not disappear simply because it is ignored. It waits. Every morning before the world demands anything from me, I face the same quiet choice: to listen or to perform, to restrain myself or to feed my ego, to remember that leadership is borrowed time, not private property. There is no final victory in this life, no moment when vigilance ends, no point at which a leader becomes safe from himself. There is only a daily decision, made quietly, often unseen, always consequential. I do not ask you to agree with me. Agreement is easy. I ask you to reflect. If something in this story unsettled you, do not rush past it. Do not drown it in noise. Do not reduce it to politics. Sit with it. Return to it when the headlines fade. Shall speak about it with people who still believe that leadership should mean more than dominance, more than spectacle, more than winning at any cost. May peace return to hearts that have hardened themselves for survival. May America remain strong without losing its conscience. May Africa rise without losing its soul. And may the world remember this simple and demanding truth. Reverence is not fear. It is wisdom learned through restraint. Each day, we must choose again. There is no final victory, only awareness or surrender.